In the world of politics and justice, few moments capture public attention the way a dramatic courtroom clash does. The recent encounter between Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett and Judge Milton Carver has become one such defining episode, drawing the eyes of the nation. What started as a $1,000 fine meant to discipline and silence Crockett quickly transformed into a powerful turning point that exposed deeper issues of authority, fairness, and accountability. Instead of being subdued, Jasmine Crockett used the fine to highlight the very flaws in the justice system and to challenge the motives behind Judge Carver's actions. Her ability to turn what was designed as a punishment into a tool of empowerment not only shocked the courtroom but also resonated with audiences across the country, sparking debates about power dynamics, political bias, and the resilience of leaders who refused to be silenced. The fine intended to silence Jasmine Crockett became her weapon to expose judicial bias, and the way this unfolded reveals much about her strategy, resilience, and understanding of power dynamics within a courtroom setting. When a judge imposes a fine, especially one as substantial as $1,000, the purpose is often more symbolic than financial. It is a declaration of authority, a reminder to the accused that the court's power is absolute and that defiance comes at a cost. For many, such a penalty is meant to instill fear, discourage dissent, and reinforce a hierarchy where the judge is unchallenged. However, in this case, Jasmine Crockett saw through the gesture, recognizing that the fine was not simply about maintaining order but rather an attempt to diminish her credibility and silence her sharp critique. By framing the fine as an unjust punishment rooted in bias rather than impartiality, she turned the tables, showing that the very act meant to discredit her instead revealed the weaknesses of Judge Milton Carver's approach. What made Crockett's reaction particularly powerful was her refusal to accept the fine passively. Many individuals, when faced with the authority of the court, will comply outwardly even if they disagree inwardly, choosing to pay the fine quietly and move on. Crockett, however, chose to spotlight the fine itself as a symbol of unfair treatment. Instead of internalizing the shame or intimidation that Judge Carver may have expected, she used it as evidence in her broader argument about systemic bias and the misuse of judicial authority. Her decision to vocalize this and take control of the narrative meant that what could have been a quiet disciplinary action transformed into a loud public debate about whether judges truly act in fairness or whether their decisions can be clouded by prejudice, personal motives, or political influence. The way she framed the issue also highlights her political instincts. In the age of social media and viral moments, Crockett understood that this was not just a courtroom matter but a spectacle that could capture national attention. By speaking out and tying the fine to a larger pattern of judicial overreach, she appealed not only to her immediate supporters but also to broader audiences who are increasingly skeptical of unchecked authority. In a sense, the $1,000 fine became less about money and more about symbolism. It represented the cost of standing firm against injustice, and Crockett wore that cost as a badge of courage rather than a mark of disgrace. This reframing turned Judge Carver's intended silencing tactic into a stage for Crockett's voice to echo louder than ever. Her ability to expose bias lies in how she contextualized the fine. Rather than allowing it to be seen as an isolated event, she linked it to a continuum of incidents where those in power attempt to suppress voices that challenge them. By placing the fine within this larger narrative, she gave it weight beyond her own personal experience, making it an example of a broader societal issue. This not only shifted the perception of the fine but also spotlighted Carver's role, putting him under public scrutiny and forcing observers to ask whether his ruling was truly impartial or politically motivated. Such reframing demonstrates the art of political communication, where a moment of apparent defeat is turned into an opportunity to highlight injustice and rally support. Furthermore, Crockett's approach to the fine demonstrates her understanding of the symbolic power of resistance. Paying the fine without question would have reinforced the judge's authority, but resisting it in words and actions weakened his moral standing. She exposed the contradiction between the idea of a court as a place of justice and the reality of a judge using financial punishment as a tool of silencing. By doing so, she encouraged people to question how often fines and sanctions are used not for justice but for control, sparking a larger conversation about accountability in the judicial system. This act of reframing is critical in exposing bias because it forces the public to see what might otherwise have been dismissed as routine procedure in a new, critical light. Another layer of her strategy was the emotional appeal tied to the fine. A financial penalty carries weight with everyday people who understand the burden of money. By refusing to treat the fine as just a personal inconvenience, she connected it to the struggles of ordinary citizens who face unfair treatment in courts and workplaces. This allowed her to bridge the gap between her high-profile position and the lived realities of the people she represents, making her stand against the fine resonate even more strongly. By aligning her resistance to the fine with the experiences of the broader public, Crockett amplified the message that bias and unfairness are not distant or abstract concepts but lived experiences that affect real lives. The exposure of bias through this incident also underscores how authority figures often underestimate the individuals they target. Judge Carver may have believed that imposing the fine would diminish Crockett's ability to challenge him, but instead, it had the opposite effect. By standing firm, Crockett revealed the imbalance of power and showed how those who abuse authority can inadvertently empower the very voices they seek to silence. This inversion of power is central to how she turned the fine into a weapon against bias. Rather than being cowed by the financial penalty, she demonstrated that courage and conviction can transform punishment into proof of injustice. At its core, Crockett's handling of the $1,000 fine shows that silence is not the only response to authority. By choosing to vocalize her opposition, question the motives behind the fine, and frame it as evidence of systemic bias, she transformed a punitive action into a rallying cry for fairness. The fine that was supposed to suppress her instead gave her a platform to reveal how bias operates, how power can be misused, and how resilience can rewrite the narrative in favor of those who refuse to be silenced. Crockett transformed a moment of punishment into a larger conversation on fairness and accountability, and the way she did so illustrates not only her personal resolve but also her ability to tap into a collective concern about how power is exercised in public institutions. What makes her response stand out is that she did not treat the $1,000 fine as an isolated event or a personal grievance, but instead elevated it into an example of a systemic problem that impacts many others. This shift in framing meant that the fine was no longer simply about a dispute between her and Judge Milton Carver, but rather about the way authority operates in the broader context of justice and politics. By positioning the fine within this larger conversation, she invited the public to reflect on how often punitive measures are used not as tools for fairness but as instruments of control. This transformation of a moment of punishment into a catalyst for dialogue is what gave her actions such power, as it resonated with audiences who see similar dynamics playing out in their own lives. One of the central ways Crockett achieved this transformation was by linking her experience to universal principles of fairness. Fairness is a value that cuts across political and social divides, and when people feel that fairness has been compromised, it sparks outrage and solidarity. By showing that her punishment was rooted not in impartial justice but in bias and an attempt to suppress her, she made the case that what happened to her could just as easily happen to anyone who dares to challenge authority. This universality gave her position strength, because she was not merely defending herself but championing a broader principle that people could rally behind. It shifted the discussion from a courtroom disagreement to a fundamental question about whether those in power are acting in the interests of justice or in self-preservation. Her approach also emphasized accountability, and this was a crucial aspect of the conversation she sparked. Accountability means that those in positions of power, whether judges, politicians, or public officials, must answer for their actions and decisions. Crockett's refusal to quietly accept the fine was in essence a demand for accountability, a call to scrutinize not only Judge Carver's specific decision but also the larger system that allows authority figures to use their positions without adequate checks. By insisting that the fine be understood as a reflection of bias rather than justice, she placed pressure on the structures that protect authority from criticism. This emphasis on accountability resonated with a public that often feels powerless in the face of unchecked decision-making and reinforced the idea that challenging unfair authority is not only possible but necessary. The broader conversation that Crockett created also had a deeply political dimension. In an environment where trust in institutions is already fragile, moments like this become symbolic of larger struggles. By turning her fine into a political talking point, she tapped into public skepticism about whether systems of justice are truly impartial. She reminded people that bias can infiltrate even the spaces meant to embody fairness, and that without accountability, those systems risk losing their legitimacy. In this way, the $1,000 fine was not just a courtroom matter but a flashpoint in an ongoing debate about how institutions function and whether they serve the people they are meant to represent. What made this transformation particularly effective was Crockett's skill in communication. She did not allow the narrative to be controlled by Judge Carver or by those who might have wanted to portray her as simply unruly or deserving of punishment. Instead, she shaped the narrative around the themes of fairness and accountability, ensuring that her perspective dominated the discussion. This communication strategy ensured that the fine was never seen purely in terms of dollars or disciplinary action, but rather as a reflection of larger injustices. The clarity with which she framed her response allowed her to take control of the story and invite others to see the situation through her lens, amplifying its impact well beyond the walls of the courtroom. The symbolic nature of her stand also deserves attention. Punishments like fines are often meant to intimidate, to discourage further resistance by showing that there is a price for defiance. By flipping this symbolism and showing that the fine itself was proof of unfair treatment, Crockett undermined the power of the punishment. She showed that what was intended as a deterrent could become a tool for resistance, a way to shine light on the very practices it was meant to conceal. This act of symbolic inversion gave her a moral high ground and turned her response into something that people could admire, support, and emulate. It also exposed the limits of punishment as a tool for silencing, demonstrating that when used unjustly, it can actually provoke stronger opposition and greater scrutiny. The larger conversation she sparked also tied into ongoing struggles for equality and representation. For many observers, her experience was not just about one woman facing one fine, but about how marginalized voices are often targeted when they refuse to conform. By placing her situation within this broader historical and social context, Crockett was able to highlight the systemic dimensions of bias and unfairness. This resonated especially strongly with communities who have long felt the effects of inequitable treatment, making her stand not just about her own circumstances but about the collective demand for fairness that extends across society. Another aspect of her transformation was her ability to bring emotion into the conversation without losing sight of reason. She articulated her frustration and opposition in a way that felt genuine and relatable, but she also tied it to principles and arguments that appealed to reason and justice. This balance allowed her to connect with audiences on both an emotional and intellectual level, strengthening the overall impact of her message. People could feel the injustice of the fine through her delivery, but they could also understand it as part of a rational critique of bias and unaccountable authority. This combination made the conversation more compelling and helped ensure that it would continue beyond the immediate moment. Ultimately, Crockett's ability to transform a personal punishment into a public dialogue about fairness and accountability demonstrated the power of resilience and strategic communication. Rather than being silenced, she amplified her voice, ensuring that the fine did not end the discussion but ignited it. By doing so, she not only defended her own integrity but also invited the public to consider how power is wielded and how systems can be challenged when they stray from their duty to uphold justice. Judge Milton Carver's decision backfired, strengthening Crockett's influence and public support, and this reversal reveals the dynamics of how authority, when misused, can undermine itself rather than reinforce its power. A fine of $1,000 imposed in a courtroom setting carries an air of finality and control. It is supposed to serve as a deterrent, a disciplinary measure to remind the recipient of their place in the hierarchy. Yet when that fine is viewed by the public as unjust, it ceases to operate as a tool of discipline and instead becomes evidence of overreach. That is precisely what happened in Crockett's case. Instead of making her appear weakened or subdued, the punishment highlighted her resilience, her defiance, and her ability to stand firm against what many perceived as an abuse of power. The result was not only a failure of the judge's intent but also an amplification of Crockett's voice in the political and public arena. The backfiring of Judge Carver's decision is tied directly to the way power is perceived by the public. Authority figures are expected to act with impartiality and fairness, and when they fail to do so, their actions are scrutinized harshly. In Crockett's case, the imposition of a fine was quickly seen not as a neutral act of maintaining courtroom decorum but as a targeted attempt to silence her. This perception undermined the legitimacy of Carver's authority. Instead of reinforcing respect for the court, his decision cast doubt on whether he was acting from principle or from bias. Crockett's ability to seize on this perception and frame the fine as unjust was central to why the decision backfired so dramatically. It turned the judge's action into a political mistake that expanded her influence rather than diminishing it. Crockett's growing influence in the wake of the fine can also be attributed to her skill in connecting her personal struggle to the wider struggles of ordinary people. The fine may have been specific to her, but the idea of being unfairly punished by someone in power resonates broadly. Many people have felt, in some form, the sting of unjust treatment at the hands of authority. By positioning herself as a representative of those shared experiences, Crockett was able to transform sympathy into support. The judge's attempt to isolate her through punishment ended up drawing more people into her corner, uniting them around the sense that her fight was not just personal but symbolic of a larger battle for fairness. The amplification of her public support also comes from the way stories spread in the modern media environment. A courtroom fine might once have been a minor detail, reported in passing and forgotten. But in today's world of social media and instant news cycles, every action carries the potential for wider visibility. Crockett's refusal to back down and her framing of the fine as biased quickly gained traction, spreading far beyond the courtroom. What Carver may have intended as a quiet disciplinary measure turned into a public spectacle, with Crockett at the center, gaining visibility and sympathy from audiences who might never have paid attention otherwise. This visibility is a form of power, and it strengthened her standing as a leader unafraid to challenge authority. The backfire effect also reveals how miscalculations by authority figures can empower those they try to suppress. Carver may have believed that the financial penalty would discourage Crockett or portray her as out of line, but his misjudgment lay in underestimating her ability to frame the situation to her advantage. Instead of appearing unruly or defeated, Crockett came across as principled and courageous. This contrast, between a judge seen as overreaching and a woman standing strong against him, played powerfully in the public imagination. It painted her as a fighter for justice, someone willing to absorb personal costs for the sake of exposing bias, and that image strengthened her influence far beyond the walls of the courtroom. Her strengthened influence was not only about perception but also about momentum. Political and social influence often grows out of moments where individuals demonstrate resilience under pressure. By refusing to be silenced by the fine, Crockett created a moment that galvanized her supporters and attracted new ones. Momentum is a powerful force in public life. Once it begins to build, it often carries individuals into larger roles, bigger platforms, and greater opportunities to shape the conversation. What Carver may have seen as a simple disciplinary measure inadvertently provided Crockett with the spark that fueled her momentum, allowing her to harness public frustration with authority and convert it into energy for her cause. Crockett's public support was further strengthened because she aligned her personal defiance with broader themes of accountability. People were not just supporting her because they liked her or agreed with her personally, but because she embodied the demand that authority figures answer for their actions. In a time when many citizens feel disconnected from or mistrustful of institutions, her stand against Carver became a rallying point for those who wanted to see power held accountable. This made her influence deeper than mere popularity. It gave her credibility as someone who lived out the values she espoused, turning her fine into proof of her commitment to fairness. The irony of the situation is that Carver's decision, intended to reinforce his control, exposed his vulnerability. By fining Crockett, he revealed that he felt threatened by her challenges, and in doing so, he undermined his own position. Authority that lashes out against criticism loses its aura of confidence and stability. Instead of appearing strong, Carver appeared defensive, and this perception worked to Crockett's advantage. Her calm and determined refusal to be cowed contrasted sharply with the judge's apparent overreach, reinforcing the narrative that she was the one standing on principle while he was the one overstepping. The backfire effect also highlights the dynamics of public opinion, where attempts to silence often create louder echoes than the original voice. Carver may have hoped the fine would reduce Crockett's platform, but in reality, it multiplied it. People rallied behind her, amplified her story, and ensured that the punishment designed to diminish her influence became the very reason her influence grew. This dynamic shows that in the modern landscape, authority must be exercised carefully, because overreach can quickly erode legitimacy and turn opponents into symbols of resistance. By the end of the episode, Crockett emerged stronger not only because she resisted the fine but because she successfully reframed the narrative. Carver's decision became a symbol of bias, while her response became a symbol of resilience. This inversion of roles, where the authority figure was weakened and the challenger was empowered, demonstrates the precarious nature of power when it is misused. What began as a $1,000 fine ended up strengthening Crockett's public image, expanding her influence, and drawing greater support to her cause, proving that sometimes the most effective way to elevate a voice is to try to silence it.